Okay, good evening, one and all, and welcome to the first in our series, Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, a set of 4 conversations we are hosting that draw from a volume of essays co-edited by tonight's speakers, Bernard Prusak and Jennifer Reed-Bouley. The book is entitled Catholic Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, Critical-Constructive Essays, and it's forthcoming from Paulist Press later this year. And I want to congratulate Bernard and Jennifer on this great success. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hanks Center here at Loyola Chicago. And I'm coming to you live from one of our many Loyola digital outposts here through the, as we walk through further together these pandemical times. On behalf of University Leadership and on behalf of Gabrielle Buckley, and who's the Ann Ida Gannon Center for Women in Leadership Director, who are co-sponsoring this event. So on behalf of Gabrielle, I want to welcome you to our Zoom cast. I extend a hearty greeting as well on behalf of our center staff, Megan Toomey, our center manager, Kathleen McNutt, our graduate student assistant, who together with me as a team, we get all these events from farm to table, and I'm really grateful for their help. So thanks, Megan and Kathleen again. Responding to the signs of the times, this book brings the lens of Catholic social thought, CST, to the enterprise of Catholic higher education in the US. Scandals in the church and the growth of religious non-affiliation in the culture have made being Catholic greatly challenging for Catholic colleges and universities. At the same time that the economics of higher education, exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, have mounted a challenge to the variability and very viability of many institutions. So this book sheds, informs us by shedding light and throwing light on what Catholic colleges and universities might and must do in order to both preserve their mission and renew it for the future. Tonight's event is called A System Adrift, Catholic Social Thought as an Anchor for Catholic Higher Education, and features the anchor text of the volume and its authors and the editors. So Bernard and Jennifer will present for about 30 minutes, and then our colleague here at Loyola, Michael Schuck, will provide a response. Now, just some housekeeping before we begin. First, to put eyes on our next event, which you've already done in the waiting room there. So I want to thank Kathleen and Megan for putting that slide up. You see the 3 other events coming down the line on February 16th, March 2nd, and March 23rd. 3 great events on 3 topics by guests and respondents from Loyola. So you can look at our website for more info there. There's also some other events from the Hanks Center that we'd appreciate you taking a look at. We do a lot of good things. It's our pleasure to do so. And we have a very busy, full, and kind of a variable potpourri of opportunities for you. So please give us a good look. Just some housekeeping now before we get to it. And really just has to do with the format of tonight's event. So tonight's Zoomcast, we're all pros here at Zoom. It's a meeting. And that means that while the chat has been limited, we're going to use it for questions, answers, and comments. So you'll direct your insights, your questions, your comments to me. So in the chat box, just select Michael Murphy and type away. And I'll be culling and collating and organizing those insights. And I just want to encourage you, it's always easier to kind of write as you go. So please, if you have a thought, put it in prose and share it, and I will organize it and hopefully get to it, right? We have a good turnout here, so I'll do my very best, I promise you. Thank you. So let's now welcome our speakers and our respondent. These are the more abbreviated bios, and please, again, check our web pages for further information. Bernard Prusak is Professor of Philosophy and Founding Director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Dr. Prusak's scholarship focuses on, moral and social philosophy. He has published widely in scholarly journals and books on such topics as parental obligations and children's rights, conscience, just war, religious liberty, the moral limits of markets, and the principles of cooperation and double effect. He also writes for Commonweal magazine, where he worked as an editorial assistant before graduate school, and he also writes for America. Bernard also serves as senior editor for the great journal, Expositions, Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities, for which he edits the forum Ethics in Focus. He is a member of the steering committee of Catholic Social Teaching, Learning, and Research Initiative, a collaboration of faculty and administrators from Catholic colleges and universities across the US. Welcome, Bernard, and good to see you again. Jennifer Reed-Bouley is professor and program director of theology at College of St. Mary in Omaha, Nebraska. She earned her PhD in Christian ethics and MA in theology from Loyola University, Chicago. Welcome home, Jennifer. And she worked with Michael Schuck, which is awesome as well. Jennifer earned her BA from the University of Notre Dame, and her article, Challenging Racism and White Privilege in Undergraduate Theology Contexts, Teaching and Learning Strategies for Maximizing the Promise of Community Service Learning. And we congratulate you on that great article, Jennifer, as well. And that appeared in Teaching Theology and Religion in 2015. The article is so good, I've seen it. It's a wonderful article. It was an award winner from the College Theology Society, their annual award for best article published in theology. Congrats again, Jennifer. Our respondent, Michael Schuck, is professor of theology here at Loyola University, Chicago, and founding director of the Joan and Bill Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage. I want to thank you again, Mike, for your vision, your work, your imagination, creativity, for founding this great center that's been growing and growing. We stand on your shoulders, my friend. His main research interests are Roman Catholic social thought, with special attention to its history, variety, and relationship to other forms of social thought, both ancient and modern, and really the places in between. So everybody, please welcome our speaker. Jennifer will go first. And without further ado, it's A System Adrift, Catholic Social Thought as an Anchor for Catholic Higher Education. Jennifer, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Bernard and I want to begin by thanking you, Mike, and the Hank Center at Loyola University Chicago for hosting this presentation, as well as the three that will follow on how Catholic social thought can inform the work of Catholic higher education. We also wish to thank Mike Schuck for offering to provide the response, as well as thank all of you who are participating in the event this evening. Our title slide features Brian Whelan's Walking on Water. Anyone who has worked for a few years as a faculty or administration at a Catholic college or university likely is familiar with how Catholic social thought, CST, often figures in the life of the institution, namely as a cudgel for faculty to wield against the administration or vice versa. Respect for human dignity, concern for the common good, the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, and even more obscure principles like subsidiarity crop up in faculty administration disputes over such matters as health insurance coverage, adjunct pay and benefits, hiring decisions, diversity on campus, and more recently, childcare and return to work protocols during the pandemic. There is sometimes a whiff of opportunism to these arguments. In those cases, the combatants wield the principles of CST not out of deep commitment, but because they are the principles that the college or university is supposed to observe as a Catholic institution, and shame on you, it is clearly implied for not embodying your commitments. Unfortunately, there can be a measure of truth to that accusation. As Joseph McCartan, who will speak with you in March, has observed, quote, Catholic campuses are increasingly entangled in a larger economy that promotes yawning inequalities, unquote. He points to the so-called gigification of teaching positions as tenure lines devolve into contingent semester-to-semester appointments, the subcontracting of auxiliary services such as feeding students, to for-profit corporations with checkered records in labor law and extravagant executive pay, and the vigorous opposition to unionization by more than a few institutions, which is ironic against the background of Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, affirming the right to form, quote, working men's associations for helping each individual member to better his condition to the utmost in body, soul, and property, unquote. Others have drawn critical attention to investment and licensing practices, which may entangle Catholic colleges and universities in exploitative supply chains and earth-degrading industries. While that picture is not pretty, it also is not the whole story. For example, McCartan points to Georgetown University's just employment policy, mandating that all campus workers be paid a living wage, and he notes that several institutions, including Georgetown, Fordham University, and St. Louis University, did not oppose, but even welcome the formation of adjunct faculty unions. Consider further the University of Dayton's board-driven decision to divest from fossil fuels, anticipating by a year Pope Francis's landmark 2015 encyclical on care for our common home, Laudato Si. Finally, experiments like Arrupe College, a Jesuit community college associated, as you know, with Loyola University Chicago, put flesh on the commitment to serve the marginalized. Catholic social thought is by no means alien to the operations of all Catholic colleges and universities. Instead, it might well be the case that in some instances, institutions do not appreciate sufficiently how they are in fact living out CST through what they do day in, day out. For example, through the particular population of students they serve or through the local community they support. Even before the pandemic, however, scandals in the church and the growth of religious non-affiliation in the culture had made being Catholic greatly challenging for Catholic colleges and universities. Now the pandemic has only exacerbated the already fragile economics of higher education, mounting a threat to the very viability of many institutions, just as the numbers of traditional college-age students have begun to decline significantly across the US. It is a vast understatement that these are trying times for American Catholic higher education. The title of our presentation alludes to Peter Steinfeld's 2003 book, A People Adrift, The Crisis of the Roman Catholic Church in America, which itself alludes to the story in the Synoptic Gospels of Jesus rebuking and quelling a violent storm that threatened to capsize the boat he and his disciples had boarded to cross the Sea of Galilee. Jesus has fallen asleep. Terrified of drowning, the disciples wake him for help. It is not unthinkable or even unlikely that a number of Catholic colleges and universities will go under, so to speak, as a result of the pandemic. The crisis that Steinfeld depicted in 2003 has new untold dimensions. It would be naive to believe that Catholic social thought is the means of salvation. But we propose that CST might help to anchor Catholic colleges and universities as they seek to weather the times or as they rebuild in the pandemic's wake. In particular, CST might help to anchor Catholic colleges and universities in their missions as distinctively Catholic institutions. Though the pandemic will not allow us to remake our social world from scratch, it does present an opportunity to examine whether the quote-unquote old normal was sustainable, desirable, or for Catholic institutions adequately faithful to Christ. Responding to the signs of the times, our presentation and the three that follow in the Hank Center series bring the lens of Catholic social thought to the enterprise of Catholic higher education in the US. Our project's aim is to stimulate and support discussion of contemporary challenges and opportunities in Catholic higher ed in light of CST. And I'm so glad that all of you are joining us to engage in this conversation this evening. The Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities proposes in its 2012 vision statement on Catholic higher education and Catholic social teaching that CST should be incorporated into, quote, all aspects of institutional life, unquote, including employment policies, environmental practices, and finances. Toward the goal of making the ACCU's vision a reality, we want to consider the opportunities and challenges CST presents for Catholic institutions to differentiate themselves from other colleges and universities, while at the same time preserving and advancing their missions and responding to current challenges in the church and world. We use the T in CST to stand for thought, but it also may stand for teaching or tradition. CST is a living, dynamic tradition that advances a vision of social justice, of right relations in social life on our common home, Mother and Sister Earth, expressed and developed through magisterial teaching, scholarship, and the lived experiences of faithful Catholics and other people of goodwill. CST includes key principles such as respect for human dignity, concern for the common good, the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, care for creation, solidarity, and subsidiarity. But those principles, while oft-cited, do not exhaust CST, which draws upon scripture, the natural law tradition, Catholicism's rich symbols and sacramental imagination, the lives of holy women and men, and a complex theological anthropology. In brief, CST is about social justice, and social justice has to do with social action, the reorganization of the social systems in which people live and work. It is a basic premise of our project that what makes a college or university Catholic includes not only the curriculum and the faculty, but also the particular lens that the institution employs in conducting its business. A college or university with its brick and mortar campus might appear to be a massive alien object, indifferent and impervious to the wishes and projects of its current generation of students, faculty, and staff, much as the natural world is set over and against its present flora and fauna. In support of this vision, as anyone who has served on a core curriculum committee knows well, change normally comes quite solely in higher education. Otherwise, liberal faculty can be remarkably conservative in some respects. Nonetheless, we are convinced that, as the historian and former college president Francis Oakley has claimed, quote, institutional life is a fragile social construct, a frail tissue of human purpose, intentionality, aspiration, and hope, unquote. From this perspective, the nature of an institution is never a given. It is always being shaped and reshaped by the ways in which its leaders, whether trustees, administrators, or faculty, define, proclaim, and embody the institution's purposes and values. The days in which it could be taken for granted that a college or university was Catholic because its leaders were vowed religious are coming to an end, if they are not over already. As Vatican II urged, the laity's apostolate must now be, quote, broadened and intensified, unquote, if the institutions that they lead are to go on being Catholic in meaningful ways. But this new reality brings new challenges. For example, for the selection, education, and formation of boards of trustees, who increasingly come from the very top of the income ladder. While we await a comprehensive study of boards of trustees of Catholic colleges and universities, recent research suggests that the education of boards in the mission and identity of Catholic colleges and universities tends to be thin, and the readiness of boards to bring Catholic mission and identity to bear on matters of policy cannot be taken for granted. The situation is hardly better for lay administrators and faculty whose formation for leadership roles is seldom given nearly the attention accorded to vowed religious. As Steinfels remarked, the upshot is that lay leaders arrive, quote, with new questions, but increasingly without old knowledge that vowed religious brought to the task. Now I'd like to turn over the rest of the presentation to Bernard.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I joked that this was to be our intermission time, but I'm going to bring this quickly to a close. That's my job. So, give me one sec. Let us conclude this presentation then with a fuller account of CST. More precisely, what seeking to live it out might look like for a given institution in our challenging times. Consider as a case study the issue of childcare, which, as we remarked earlier, has arisen with urgency in the context of the pandemic. Working parents, as you know, are scrambling as their children's schools open only online or adopt a hybrid model, combining some days of in-person instruction with some days of online instruction, or offer instruction, whether in person or online, only 2 or 3 days per week, if that. Childcare is expensive and frankly frightening when the threat of infection is high. Who wants to send his child off to daycare when it has been judged too risky for schools to open? And who wants to open her home to a caregiver who might prove to be a carrier of the virus? In any event, as we know, some parents can afford neither. Historically, and to this day, childcare responsibilities have disproportionately fallen on women. During the last 100 years in the United States, women made great gains in combining family and work, or in other words, children and careers. The economist Claudia Golden warns, however, that the increased burden from school closings could erase years of gains by young women. Once more in her words, quote, "The COVID economy has magnified gender differences at work and at home," end quote. Because couple equity is expensive for the family unit, it limits couples' career choices, or raises the cost of childcare, or poses opportunity costs for family life. For example, no piano lessons if no parent can take the child to the lessons. Golden expects that men will go back to work full-time and revert to what she calls BCE, before coronavirus era childcare levels, while women's careers, by and large, probably will be set back. The data so far suggests just that. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in September 2020, more than 1.1 million people over the age of 20 stopped looking for work. Women made up 80% of those 1.1 million, around 865,000. For colleges and universities, the effects will be seen in the population of professors and the future of academic leadership. What's more, it should be noted that the typical obstacles faced by students who are mothers have become even more daunting. Providing for their children through paid employment was already a lot. Now they often must provide some education too, lest their children fall behind. Magisterial teaching is shot through with gender essentialism and sexism about the proper place of women. But there are countervailing principles that cut against the non-starter position that mothers simply should stay home, which often is neither desirable nor feasible in our economy. First, and thankfully, the equal dignity of all persons, whether male, female, or gender nonconforming, is a given in Catholic thought, though, as you know, the Church is quite divided about how to respond to the LGBTQ+ movement. Second, there is what is called the principle of participation, which figures prominently in accounts of CST. Consider, as a way to put flesh on this principle, participation in a classroom. Class participation is both a duty and a right, and it seems plausible to argue that the right to participate is grounded in the duty to do so, which might be unpacked as a duty to contribute to the common good that is the class. Imagine, though, that the teacher refuses to call on you, or that, on account of systemic prejudice against you because of your gender, race, or ethnicity, your contributions are brushed aside and discounted. You are the victim of what philosophers call epistemic injustice. You've been wronged in your capacity as a knowing subject. In that context, it makes sense to construe your right to participate as a claim right that you hold over and against others who owe you better. Otherwise, you are not accorded the respect that you're due as a person, and you are blocked from developing yourself as a student and as an educated member of our society. In the context of CST, the principle of participation is the name for the claim right people have, based on their dignity as children of God, not to be excluded from the means of developing themselves, or as it is often put, fulfilling themselves as human beings. In the US political context, we might compare the April 2020 ruling by the US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit that public school children have a constitutional right protected by the 14th Amendment to an education that plausibly enables them to become literate. In CST, the focus falls on participation in the economy, and a key document is Pope John Paul II's 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, published 100 years after Rerum Novarum. Pope John Paul observes that, quote, and this is a long quotation, "Many people, perhaps the majority today, do not have the means which would enable them to take their place in an effective and humanly dignified way within a productive system in which work is truly central to human fulfillment, as it has become in contemporary economies. They have no possibility of acquiring the basic knowledge which would enable them to express their creativity and to develop their potential. They have no way of entering the network of knowledge and intercommunication, which would enable them to see their qualities appreciated and utilized. Thus, if not actually exploited, they are to a great extent marginalized. Economic development takes place over their heads, so to speak, when it does not actually reduce the already narrow scope of their old subsistence economies, end quote. Such an economy of exclusion, as it's termed, facilitates and is an expression of what Pope Francis calls a throwaway culture, which regards the masses of people, excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape, as mere leftovers of a bygone age, whose well-being is a matter of general indifference. According to CST, however, work is more than a way to make a living. It's a form of continuing participation in God's creation. And as such, access to work that enables one both to make a living and to realize oneself, like access to a basic education, is a right of each and every human being whom the Creator has called into being. In brief, work is a pro-life issue. Yet several qualifications are in order. To begin with, the right to work is not, of course, absolute. Like other rights, it is held in a network of duties to respect not only other people's rights and duties, but the integrity of the natural world. Work must be both just and sustainable. Further, and yet more to the point, a right to work is inert. It does nothing for no one, both if work is not available and if the obligation to provide it falls on no one or no body in particular. The right to work is dependent on social structures and institutional frameworks. A society must organize itself to make work available, and people with social and other forms of capital must see themselves as obligated to provide it. In other words, if there is a right to work, as CST holds there is, satisfying it is a matter of social justice properly speaking. It demands social action, which is to say the collaboration and sometimes creation of groups and bodies and institutions that take it on themselves to bring about systemic change. Pope Pius XI illustrates this point. In his 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, issued 40 years after Rerum Novarum, Pius remarks, quote, "Every effort must be made that fathers of families receive a wage large enough to meet ordinary family needs adequately. But if this cannot always be done under existing circumstances, social justice demands that changes be introduced as soon as possible, whereby such a wage will be assured to every adult working man," end quote. Beyond the blatant sexism, what warrants attention here is the implicit distinction Pius draws between so-called commutative justice, which has to do with right relations between individuals, like an employer and an employee, and social justice, which demands systemic change so that individual relations can be right. On this account, the duty to work for social justice is a duty to engage in social action with the aim of righting injustices that, solely by ourselves, we are hopeless to overcome. If there is to be effective change, it must be at the systemic level of institutions. New norms and sets of rules, likely requiring new social structures with new positions and roles, must be developed to reorganize social interactions. In that light, then, let us return to the issue of childcare in the context of the pandemic. Our Catholic colleges and universities duty-bound to accommodate employees with school-aged children at home, for example, by permitting faculty in need to teach online. Given the principle of participation, as well as Catholicism's commitment to the goodness of procreation and family life, which follows from the basic faith commitment to the goodness of creation, it might appear that such a course of action is indeed mandatory. But let us imagine that at a particular college or university, maybe yours, resources are quite tight. Moreover, the great majority of students and the great majority of tuition-paying parents of students want instruction to be in person rather than principally online. Finally, competition for students among comparable colleges and universities is fierce. Would it be unjust for the administration to reject faculty demands for accommodation? It might be unwise to do so without first exploring creative alternatives. Further, perhaps it would be feasible to grant a limited number of requests for the cases of greatest need. If so, an institution that takes its Catholic identity to heart should grant those requests. But the availability of high quality, affordable childcare is not a problem that any one college or university can solve. The availability of childcare is a social problem, the solution to which requires social action. Claudia Golden claims that what we need in this regard is no less than good government, which might institute programs like those of the Works Progress Administration in the Great Depression. Note that, on this account, CST is no mere cudgel for faculty to wield against the administration or vice versa. Instead, CST is a means to clarify and elaborate the moral stakes of the issue at hand, here the issue of childcare, where what is at stake is participation in meaningful work and the fulfillment and financial security that it brings. The broader point is that the various principles of CST do not yield simple answers or dictate solutions. More critically, they raise, frame, and provide substantive terms to discuss and deal with morally fraught questions. To that end, CST foregrounds the social context, more fully the socio-political economic context, in which Catholic colleges and universities operate. It demands both that we reckon with the constraints imposed by that context and that we see institutions as potential agents of social change, and sometimes perhaps as obstacles, especially if they or their leaders benefit from the current order. Socio-politico-economic constraints are not, however, an excuse for inaction. They do not provide cover for quiescence. As Pius XI wrote in his 1937 encyclical Divini Redemptoris, where it is true that there are obstacles to justice, it is a duty to seek creative ways to overcome those obstacles. Affronts to social justice require social action, to which Catholic colleges and universities may be positioned to contribute. By way of example, and to bring this to a close, College of St. Mary, CSM, a women's university in Omaha, Nebraska, at which Jennifer teaches, elected to allocate some of its CARES Act funding for expenses incurred because of the pandemic to establishing in August 2020 an on-campus kids club as a response to local school districts' decisions to teach fully online or in a hybrid plan. 15 CSM undergraduates, under the guidance of a full-time director, provide supervised tutoring, computer help for online classes, and activities for kindergarten through 6th grade children during the days that they are not physically in school. CSM offers the program every weekday from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. About 40 children participate in the program, which requires registration, masks, social distancing, and daily temperature checks. Because about 10% of CSM students are single mothers for whom safe childcare is difficult to secure and may be prohibitively expensive, the program is essential to the university's mission to empower women to complete their education. It also allows faculty and staff with children to continue to provide in-person instruction and support to students at CSM, rather than choose to leave the workforce in order to attend to their children's education. It remains to be seen if the Kids Club will be sustainable, but it is an example of an institution creatively seeking to ensure, in accord with its mission and CST, that people can pursue meaningful work. Future presentations in this series will extend and deepen these reflections with respect to other challenges and opportunities now before U.S. Catholic colleges and universities. You'll hear from Laura Nichols, Associate Professor of Sociology at Santa Clara, on the structural factors affecting the demographics of our student bodies, from Joseph McCartan, Professor of History at Georgetown University, on labor policies and problems, and from Catherine Punsalan-Monimos, Assistant to the President for Mission Integration at University of Detroit Mercy, on women's and lay leadership. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward now to Mike Schuck's response.
Thank you, Jennifer and Bernard. It's really a privilege to have this opportunity to join you in your kind of vigilant pursuit of identity with integrity for Roman Catholic colleges and universities, and the role that Catholic social teaching can play in that pursuit. And you give a really helpful sample of the CST principles and that are available to Catholic colleges and universities as they reach for or try to sustain an authentic Catholic identity. And I want to thank you for opening that cornucopia to us of everything from that you ended there with the CSM Kids Clubs, and Bernard, the child care discussion is really rich and thought-provoking. So I want to thank you for opening that up for us. I really have been reflecting the last few days, reading your paper, and also just thinking about you. Now, Bernard, I don't know you, but I know Jennifer quite well, and I can't read this paper without thinking about Jennifer. And I know I'm going to embarrass her, but that your embarrassment will come a little bit later. But a thought did occur to me when I was reading the paper, and it's not like anything that all of you don't know. It's more like the stones that I've just turned the kaleidoscope, and they've just rearranged a little bit for me. So follow me on this and see if it has any bearing on your discussion. So I think it's safe to say that, like thousands of people who have made their known and unknown contributions to modern Catholic social thought since the 18th century, the majority of them, I have to believe, lived in lay, religious, or mixed intentional communities, that is, residential communities of men and women, and in some cases with children, that were designed for living together, sharing community tasks, pooling income. Now, obviously, religious orders of men and women are examples here, but of course, you have to think of the lay institutes of brothers, and obviously the Catholic worker. But I think there's really an unwritten history of intentional faith communities, of families, of Catholic families living together and sharing tasks and resources. And I think this has been something that has been evident through the 19th century in Europe, and also in the history of American Catholicism. So I would say then, with the exception of the Catholic worker and a few others, then the experiences of living in these kinds of organized communities have not really been made an explicit resource for reflection on the principles and actions that are recommended in Catholic social thought. For instance, I can't think of a line in John Courtney Murray's writings where he ever kind of reflected on what living in a community of men, sharing meals, praying together, pooling resources, how that might have impacted his perception of community or human dignity, or the principles that he drew on in his voluminous reflections on Catholic social teaching. And I can't think of a single encyclical where a pope kind of did it aside and talked about his own experience of living in an intentional community and how that bore witness to a principle or an observation that he was making in the text. But I just have to believe, wouldn't it defy common sense to imagine that this context had no bearing on their thoughts, or was not kind of covertly operating? So CTS, is possible even as strong as the explicit questions and articles of Aquinas' Summa. There again, you read the Summa, Aquinas is never talking about his experience of community living and how that might have some bearing on how he reads Aristotle. If you extracted, but I wonder if, we have the principle of the sociality of the person, the person as a political animal, the principle of the person as a social being, as an abstract principle that comes through Aristotle, and we kind of, we imbibe in that. But if you extracted Thomas's lived experience of communal living, would the same kind of communitarian meaning of that phrase, transfer into Catholic social teaching? So do we take this kind of non-conscious or unconscious existential communitarianism, maybe we could take it as an undertone throughout the majority of the texts that constitute Catholic social teaching, maybe as some kind of imperceptible more to the principle of the common good, or to the principle of rights, or to the principle of freedom, that is not Rawls' common good, right? And it's not Rousseau's common good. So I mentioned undertone. I'll use another musical metaphor. I'm going to say this is Catholic social theory in the key of C, that is in the key of intentional community. And intentional community that's premised on mutual care, shared resources, divine love. The context that I think the majority of the people that created this material were coming out of, but didn't necessarily directly talk about. Now, Marx and Mill and Foucault and Bourdieu and Habermas and Rawls, they're all social theorists and ethicists of the highest order, but none of them played their social wisdom in the key of C. And Catholic social thought does that. It's an elusive quality. It can't be put into a syllogism. It's not necessarily kind of communicated in a concrete principle. There's an elusive communitarianism to this. And may we dare say that is an echo of our communal lives, particularly the communal lives of people that lived in communities of pooled resources and intentional sharing. But I guess the point here is that that's where, to me, Bernard's point about using Catholic social teaching as a shaming device. I mean, people that use Catholic social teaching as a shaming device are not using it in the key of C, right? People that use it as a cudgel, they're not using it in the key of C. They're out of tune. And when a university uses Catholic social teaching as a rhetorical flourish for a Catholic university marketing campaign, I mean, that is completely out of tune. So, and then maybe some of you have had this experience where you can find yourself in this anomalous situation where a secular university is playing its social ethical principles in the key of C, and the Catholic institution that you're familiar with that promotes Catholic social teaching is not playing it in the key of C at all. Now that may not be, that may be anomalous, but there was Jesus at the well, so anomaly is part of our reality. So maybe to play Catholic social teaching in the key of C, you have to start, and I'm sounding very apodictic here, but maybe you have to start with a felt intention that maybe never appears on the surface, but it's an intentionality of relinquishment, that kind of giving up and giving away, that giving over, narcissistic egoism, giving over greed, giving over cynicism, self-righteous cleverness, all these acids that eat away at the life of communal living, eat away at teamwork, eat away at pooled income projects, acids that would really eat away at the undertone of Catholic social teaching, and the undertone that allows Catholic social teaching to give Catholic institutions its authentic identity. Authentic identity. Now, in my experience, I thought of this kind of bridge too. In my experience, many students are very interested in participating and even forming intentional communities. And intentional communities dedicated to social justice. And I was just checking, the Foundation for Intentional Communities in the United States, which registers about 100,000 intentional communities in the United States. In the last 10 years, the number has doubled. The millennials there's a rising interest in the millennial population and younger in the kind of authenticity of of intentional communities. And maybe some of you in the classroom have had that experience. And I feel like I experienced that same thing at Standing Rock when thousands of people were pouring into this place in nowhere in North Dakota, hungry for an intentional community, a shared experience that was the promotion of justice. And it seems to me that were Catholic colleges and universities to tap into this living undertone of Catholic social teaching through intentional community education, intentional community curricula, intentional community workshops, intentional community education, then I think that the principles of Catholic social thought would start to sing, right, in the university. Now here's where Jennifer gets embarrassed, but I knew Jennifer, when she came to Loyola Airthese, many years ago, and you could sense that Jennifer was already at a place in her formation where a real Catholic social teaching could be birthed. You could tell there was a sensibility of relinquishment, of relinquishment of narcissism, of greed. There was incredible generosity in sharing with her peers, her other graduate students. That there she was tapping into, I think, and other students that have come down the pike, tapping into a real stream of that undertone of communitarianism that is what gives life to these principles. And so I would say, she was already singing in the key of C. And when she learned Catholic social teaching, it was hand in glove. And she spent her life and her career in this. And I suspect that with Bernard, it's a similar story. So, I'm not sure if Catholic colleges and universities need an anchor in Catholic social teaching. I think what they surely need is people who can sing in the key of C. And I thank Jennifer and Bernard for their singing tonight.
Well, let's hear it, everybody. That's a wonderful discussion that's not linked yet, but it will be linked momentarily. I usually go right to questions, but because Michael Schuck has entered some new nomenclature of deep interest to me. We played guitar and banjo together a couple times, but it's the key of C. And I just think Bernard and Jennifer should have a chance to respond to that central kind of sea change feeling that almost challenges the anchor metaphor that you're working with. So how about some brief thoughts on that, Jennifer and Bernard?
Sure. Well, I'll start. First of all, Mike, thanks so much for your response. And I wasn't expecting to publicly be embarrassed in this or complimented. So thank you very much. And I'm really grateful for your mentorship while I was at Loyola, and also for your continued scholarship on communitarianism as the undertone of Catholic social thought, and helping us to remember that it's not only about papal documents and bishops' documents, but it's about the lived experiences of lay people, vowed religious, et cetera, both individually and families and social movements, et cetera. So thank you for that. With regard to how the communitarian undertone and the key of C, and I really appreciate that metaphor, might affect the way that we think about our work. I think that what that might do is help us to focus on how are Catholic colleges and universities already living out this ethos of communitarianism. And as I mentioned very briefly in my introductory comments, but might not even be sufficiently aware of how they are living that out, and might not be articulating it in terms of Catholic identity and mission. So I think a basic premise of our project is that all of the Catholic colleges and universities are doing their best to live out their identity and mission. And that looks really different in lots of different institutions. But that perhaps our book and the discussions that we have will help us to articulate more clearly how those are associated with our mission and identity in terms of Catholic social thought.
Thank you. Bernard, do you have a thought on that?
I'm not sure it could be as articulate as Jennifer's. I think that was well put. Mike, it's an interesting question, though, which metaphor might take us further, let's say. So we went with the metaphor of the anchor and the allusion to Peter Steinfels' book, The System Adrift, as opposed to a people adrift. But it's an interesting suggestion. I simply will echo Jennifer's point that it's probably the case that in many ways our institutions already are acting consistent with CST, already embodying it, already singing in the key of C, as you put it. But very often we don't have adequate language, I think, or perhaps insight into what we're most deeply about. And as Jennifer suggests, perhaps one contribution of our project might be greater clarity about just what the mission of Catholic higher education is in the United States. So obviously that's a rather ambitious aim, but maybe we can throw some further light on that question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. I'm gonna contextualize a little bit and move to some other communities within the college and university kind of matrix. So here's a pair of thoughts. They're related, but not exactly similar. This is from Regina Haney. What old knowledge do board members need to carry on the mission of colleges and universities? That's one side of the thought. The other side of the thought comes from Christopher White. How can we help faculty at Catholic colleges and universities prioritize CST when it conflicts with their personal interests? Who wants to take a stab at that one?
Bernard, do you want to start on that one?
Which of the two? So let me scribble a little bit about that second one. I'll begin with that question about boards. We have to be careful here not to speak too generally, right, and to make too many general statements about boards of trustees, since they look quite different at each and every institution. I imagine we can make some general claims, and if anybody's interested, I wrote a paper a few years back in the Journal of Catholic Higher Education on boards of trustees, 50 years after the movement to incorporate colleges and universities separately from founding.
Bernard, I'm going to ask you for that paper. People check back in with the recording and you can read that paper.
Sure. All right, but it's a good question. What old knowledge do board members need? Well, one answer, but only one answer, and again, it's a very good question, is that board members need, or we think would benefit from, greater knowledge of the tradition of Catholic social thought. So it's one dimension of the Catholic intellectual tradition. I think we've got to emphasize CST does belong to the Catholic intellectual tradition for sure. It doesn't exhaust it, but it's rooted within it. So I think board members could well benefit from much more intentional introduction to CST as they join the board and throughout their service on the board as well. I don't suggest, though, let me be clear, that board members need to know CST because then they would make much better decisions, and then they would direct Catholic colleges in ways much more consistent with Catholic identity. That might well be the case, but I don't want to be saying that otherwise boards would lead us all astray. What Jennifer and I are suggesting, and please piggyback here, Jennifer, or correct for that matter, is that CST, one function of CST is to raise questions that might otherwise not be raised, is to provide substantive terms with which to discuss those questions, to frame those questions in ways that could support conversation across the institution, conversation as well within the board. From my research of boards of trustees, what I found is that there's very little introduction of Catholic social thought to boards. There's very little, at least the institutions I studied, there's very little time taken to tell new board members, these are principles that you should know. These are principles that might make a difference in the kinds of questions you might ask. These are principles that might make a difference in the kinds of conversations we might have. Sometimes boards do learn about CST, but it's generally just because, so-and-so might have raised some question, maybe a priest in particular, and reference CST. There's generally no discussion up front with board members. And again, generally, I don't want to claim that's true of all institutions, about these principles. So that'd be one answer to that question. What old knowledge do board members need? We'd say, what we're trying to do with our project, since one audience for our project precisely is members of boards of trustees. All right, Jennifer, I went on much longer than I had planned, so please.
Well, that was really helpful. Thank you. And I would just add, with regard to faculty, as I take the question, it's how can faculty prioritize Catholic social thought when it might conflict with their personal interests? In my experience, I haven't seen that it so much conflicts with personal interests as that for faculty who are outside of philosophy and theology, there might be a reticence to engage in discussions of Catholic social thought because it's not the person's disciplinary specialization. And so people want to be careful about not going outside of their own expertise. One of my interests is how can Catholic social thought, and here I'm talking not only about principles, but I'm also talking about the lives of holy women and men, let's say the founder or foundress of the order that sponsors the institution. In Mike's, going back to Mike's discussion of the communitarian impulse, the lived communities and experiences who've really put flesh on all of this. But my interest is how could faculty, let's say in non-theology or philosophy class that isn't explicitly about Catholic social thought, how can we use the background of Catholic social thought to frame the way that we teach? So what implications does it have for our pedagogy? And I think it really has significant implications, particularly as we're talking about diversity and inclusion of students of color, of underrepresented students, of students who may be first-generation students. So we might think about, let's say, the principle of option for the poor, which would say that we should put a disproportionate attention on the experiences and thoughts of those who have been historically and currently undervalued, so that it would implicate that the faculty member should create the kind of learning community in which every student's voice is really welcomed, and not just welcomed in theory, but that there are skills and strategies to try to elicit the voices of those who might not feel as comfortable, let's say, speaking up in a class discussion. So it seems to me that Catholic social thought has a lot of implications that are underdeveloped as of yet, even for the way in which we conduct our classes. And I've just given an example of classroom dynamics, but the same could be developed for our choice of resources. Who is the author of the texts that we say are normative for the canon, et cetera. So that would just be a little snippet of a response to that question, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Michael Schuck, do you have any thoughts on that? You have experience with working with boards, I think, a little bit.
Well, you notice Jennifer's response there on pedagogy, which, is about a participatory pedagogy, a sharing pedagogy, a co-learning pedagogy. Well, that started with Jennifer. That impulse, it's hard to kind of parachute into a person's head. I mean, that's something that needs time to incubate. And I don't know any other way to incubate it than to have the old-fashioned retreats. I know, years ago, you'd go out on a weekend and you'd hate it because you think, I've finally got a weekend free from this place. I have to go on a retreat. But then, by the second day, you're interacting with your colleagues in a way you never have before. And there's issues coming up that you've never talked about one another before. So I think it's got to be really concrete. And going back to the Board of Trustees, get those folks on retreat. And don't call a retreat like something you do in a day. It's formation. And I don't know how else you can do it other than through that the experience of sharing and reflecting under really good guidance.
People blanch at, or it seems to me, Michael, that people don't like the word formation so much anymore. It seems to be infringing on people's agency. Have you found that to be the case?
I don't know. Let's ask Bernard and Jen for that.
I leave it there for just an observation. Let's get to, I have loads and loads of questions, you guys. So let me just do another pairing here that are related. Here's one from Christine Farr. Given that many older alumni are not very familiar with Catholic social teaching and sometimes see our efforts, and I think she's talking about professors perhaps, they sometimes see our efforts to honor social justice, particularly with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as us not being Catholic with a capital C, but catering rather to those who are not Catholic. So that's one. The other one's this. This is a little longer, but if you could kind of jot down a thought on this, I think you'll see the pairing. This is from Dr. Randy Hetherington from University of Portland. And he writes this: there seem to be external societal forces that are sometimes quietly and sometimes not so quietly seeking to suppress, maybe too strong a word, he says, or limit outward Catholic speech, practices, and expressions of faith by university faculty and staff, particularly at student events or in classes. He goes on to say the origin of these efforts appear to be non-Catholic students expressing that they feel this is exclusive and inequitable, even though they choose to be there. So he says he's sensitive to all parties, but wonders about this kind of fragile dichotomy of populations that seem to be characterizing many of our universities. So any thoughts on that? Jennifer, let's start with you this time.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah.
So I see why you paired these. They're helpful. It's a helpful pairing in terms of the multiple audiences and the multiple constituents that Catholic colleges and universities are serving simultaneously, alums, students, faculty, etc. With regard to the first question about alums perhaps seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts as kind of catering to non-Catholics as opposed to being an expression of Catholic identity, I guess I can see how that could happen, but I can also see how a program of education could help those alums see that though the official Catholic social teaching has not been as progressive on issues of racial justice as it has been, let's say, on issues of economic justice. And we have a long ways to go in terms of both our teaching and our action as Catholic universities on issues of racism, systemic injustice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I guess we could point, though, to the hopeful strands that we can find in both the documentary tradition as well as in, again, going back to what Mike Schuck said, the lived experiences of so many different Catholic lay groups, etc. So I think that that issue could be resolved if the alums were open to some kind of dialogue and further education about how this really truly is consistent with Catholic identity and mission. In fact, it's a key component of living our Catholic identity and mission. Bernard, do you want to add to that and take the second one?
I was looking at my phone. We were emailed the second question, so I might have to look at my phone again in order to answer it. May I say just very briefly, Jennifer, about diversity? Now, there's a chapter in our book, and actually 2 chapters in the book we're editing on this question. It's, I think, crucially important for Catholic colleges and universities. Let me just say, I think it's a great question for us, Catholic colleges and universities, to articulate the value of diversity within our Catholic mission. So I think that's a key challenge that Catholic colleges and universities ought to take as a challenge. So I'm hearing from Christine, we've got alums saying, you're just following the latest trends and trying to diversify your student body. I think we got to hear that challenge and say, okay, this is what you're suggesting already, Jennifer. Let's articulate just why diversity and inclusion really are central to our Catholic mission. I think there's work to be done there. I don't think it's work that's been done. I think it's important work to be done, and a real opportunity as well for Catholic colleges and universities there to be, I think, on the growing edge, so to speak, of the church. All right, that other question. So give me a sec here.
I'm gonna, as you're reading, I'm gonna say out loud another question that you can weave in from Jane Engelke.
Wait a minute, that's not helping, Mike. All right.
It'll be. So, I think it's similar, but it's how does the church's marginalization of women, how can it marginalize women and then ask for credibility when it speaks about social justice? Those concerns.
All right, well, thankfully, we also have a chapter on women's and lay leadership. And Catherine Punsalan Monlimos was among us at least a few minutes ago. I'm not going to go through all the TV screens. She'll be presenting to the Hank Center on that question. Geez, good one. As a father of 2 daughters, it's one that I grapple with in our household. Were you trying to help me, Mike, and throwing that new question into the mix while I read this one full paragraph?
I don't know. I'm trying to text her. I mean, I wasn't trying to handicap or kneecap you, as it were.
Give me one sec.
Or throw you any peccadillos in your path. But I think there's connections to these.
Yeah. Let me just try to tackle that other question. And I think it speaks to the question that you just introduced too. Look, Jennifer and I said at the beginning, CST is not like, the solution to all our problems, right? I mean, it's naive to think CST is our salvation. We've got this great body. And if I hear again that CST is the best kept secret of the church, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I don't want to hear that ever again. It's an important dimension and element of our intellectual tradition. I've held workshops with our faculty. Our faculty, may or may not be Catholic, meaning the faculty members who come to the workshops may or may not be Catholic. CST gives you substantive terms, one more time, with which to discuss really important questions in our colleges and universities and in our society. So, you can talk about women's and lay leadership within our institutions, and you're not going to come away feeling all that great. You're going to come away feeling like, geez, there's a lot of work for our institutions to do. And geez, the church has got a lot to learn from American society on this particular point. And to the point, I think it's a question from somebody at the University of Portland that expression of Catholic identity sometimes might not be welcome at the institution. Well, again, one advantage or benefit better of CST, of talking about these quite fraught questions in terms that CST provides, is that you can get a conversation going about things that matter to everybody at your institution. And it happens to be a conversation that's drawing on this rich Catholic tradition. That's great. It's a conversation in which everybody can participate, to which everybody can contribute. And it so happens that CST raises and frames questions that everybody's going to want to talk about. That's a great advantage for CST. It's a great benefit. It's a great resource for us at our institutions. And that's, our project is intending to support and facilitate and give further substance to those conversations. All right, Jennifer, that was the best I could do. Please.
I think that was excellent. Thank you.
Well, gosh.
Thank you both. Michael, did you have a thought on that? There's a lot there.
I'm thinking of an analogy to what is in Laudato Si, and as you know, when you look into the literature on environmental ethics, it's a common refrain how we need an ecological conversion. We need an environmental conversion. So there's this common sense that, the large motor engine of our economy and of our politics are really moving in a very catastrophic dimension. And the change is so fundamental that we need to do to counter that. We have to go really inside of ourselves and have a conversion. And I think the same applies in Roman Catholic social thought. And I guess it goes back to my point. There needs to be a conversion to community. And short of that, it's principles that are interesting to talk about, and I think we need a conversion to community, and then it comes alive.
Okay. These 75 minutes have expired rather quickly. I have one more question, but I want to kind of respond to you, Michael, Jennifer, and Bernard, just as a director's privilege, I guess, because I wrote down some notes before, this last couple of weeks, and thinking about CST as anchor. Well, as opposed to what other anchors might there be at Catholic colleges? CST is a very active. It might be a category of ethics or action for some scholars, but what about these other enterprises on campus? The center of our campuses have chapels on them, and I think, Mike, you're really talking about this because you mentioned conversion, you mentioned retreat and thinking and praying. So, what about liturgical life, the life of faith, the life of prayer, as another wing on this bird, that seems to be falling off. These numbers are falling off in some ways. How do we renew that life on campuses? How important is it to informing our efforts and strengthening us to be in the vineyard, in the world, working for justice and working for equity? So I just asked that as a rhetorical question, and I want to give you a practical question to close. So here's one from Tim Hipskind, and pardon me, Tim, if I have it wrong, but he wants to look at this. Are there any studies that to look at which universities have prioritized CST versus measurable successes that can be used to argue that following CST is not merely idealistic, but can be a part of a well-discerned pedagogical strategy? Jennifer alluded to an article by Joe McCartan. Are there other examples of these kind of practical studies of fruit being born of the tree?
I'll just begin briefly. That's a great question. I'd love to see a comprehensive study of that. The only thing that I'm aware of is assessments of those universities who have divested from fossil fuels and reinvested in sustainable energies. And the concern, of course, was they're going to lose a lot of money if they do this. And from what I've seen, they have not, and in fact have done quite well. So that was their action in accord with Laudato Si and with other Catholic social thought on environmental sustainability and climate change. That's the only one I'm aware of. You all might know of others.
Please, Michael, you're ready to go. Any thoughts from your vast experience in the field?
I'm going to take a pass on that one, Michael. I'm kind of chewing on it, and nothing ready is coming to mind.
Okay, fair enough. Bernard.
I'll just point to one example, namely Dayton, which even before Laudato Si, as we noted in our paper too, decided to divest from fossil fuels, and it's done well by itself. And Joe McCartan discusses Georgetown's just wage policy too. I don't know of any comprehensive study though of initiatives that institutions have undertaken in accord with CST, whether deliberately or not. Mike, can I speak though to your musing question?
Please.
And I don't have too much to say, so maybe Jennifer, you'd like to say a little bit more. I mean, for sure, there are other anchors, and we mean CST, if we're to use that metaphor of anchor again, as only one anchor among others, right? So we propose that it's an anchor for Catholic colleges and universities, as an anchor that might be of interest in particular to staff and faculty, that might make some difference for boards. We began, maybe somewhat cynically by saying that CST often figures as a cudgel. Well, it does. It's generally instrumentalized. It's generally used by faculty against administration, by administration against faculty. It can be so much more than that. It can do so much more than that for our institutions. Do we need other anchors, so to speak, if we're to use that metaphor? Yes, right? As more and more students come to us who don't identify with a religious tradition, in other words, as more and more nuns, N-O-N-E-S, come to us, well, we really need to think deeply about the spiritual needs of those students, right? How those students are to be served and developed spiritually. CST is not the answer to that question. Jennifer?
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very well said, and I appreciate that. I think maybe CST could be a meeting place for people who are unchurched or who don't have the background. That's hopeful, and it's so rich, as you say. And maybe when you come in that door, you begin to be more curious about what informs it, and then you maybe take the time. So let's just do one last word for people, and we'll start with our respondent. Mike, give just a final a word of good night to our group.
This has been a pleasure. Like I said, just taking their Jennifer and Bernard's work and just letting it play. I appreciate that, and I really appreciate your passion on this question. I think Catholic social teaching will be what remain if Catholic colleges and universities remain over time. It's going to be that experiential distillate of community read through the Eucharist, read through the Catholic experience of God. That'll be what's left, and the big ones will go their way, and the kind of the little ones will go. So I do think Catholic social teaching is whatever more metaphor you use, that's going to be there.
Thank you, Michael. What do you think, Bernard? Final word.
I think thank you for hosting us, Mike, and thank you for all your questions. And I want to encourage people to come here. Laura Nichols, I see you on TV, Laura. So Laura's a future speaker, and I think Catherine is still with us. So there's a lot more to learn from these other people, and I'm really looking forward to those talks as well. Thanks, Mike, for hosting this whole series. It's really
helpful. Bernard. Thank you. Congrats on your book. Thank you, Bernard. Jennifer, please, what's your word of good night to our community?
Oh, I want to express my gratitude to the Hank Center, to all of you for participating. It's really hopeful that so many people are interested in engaging in this conversation. I feel, Mike, that your response is going to help us to improve this book. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, well, let's put it together for our guests. And thanks so much to everybody for tuning in. I think I'll give you the chord of C as we say goodnight. So here we go. Whoops.
Very good. Very good.
Everybody. Take care. Couldn't resist. Good night.